Greetings and welcome to Informal Logic, Questions and Answers in Dialogue. Again, this was taken from text from the preeminent author Douglas Walton. He has dozens of books that focus on informal logic and argumentation. So, thank you very much there in the chat. Yes, now it should be clear to hear. Okay. That said, let's get to this presentation because what we're doing is we're going through his book here, which is full of illustrative detail about key failures of argument, how errors occur, fallacies, etc. And it helps get some sound strategies for reason persuasions and critical responses. And this part here that we're going over right now is on questions and answers in dialogue. And it builds from our previous live streams involving dialogue and irrelevancy too in questions. So let's get going. So the nature of questions in dialogue. In dialogue, questions seek information, but answering also commits the respondent to presuppositions. What's a presupposition? A presupposition of a question is a proposition that is presumed to be acceptable to the respondent when the question is asked, so that the respondent becomes committed to the proposition when he gives any direct answer. Let's pick that apart. So, answering commits the respondent to presupposition. The presupposition of a question. Someone asks a question, there's a presupposition attached. It's a proposition that is presumed to be acceptable to the respondent when the question is asked, so that the respondent becomes committed to the proposition when he gives any direct answer. Think about that. Becoming committed to a proposition, that's a presupposition of a question. When you give any direct answer, negative or affirmative. So the application we see here is that every question carries assumptions that shape commitments. Notice how many words we have here. We have presuppositions, presumed, presumptions. We have propositions. We have assumptions. So notice how all these words have very distinct meaning in this expression here. Again, the question carries assumptions that shape commitments from any direct answer. Loaded presuppositions. So let's look at some of these critical analysis of these questions here. Before we do that, let's get to the chat. Make sure the sound's going good. Facetious Expert says, it's ironic the day you started this series, I had just brushed up on logical fallacies and introduced some new ones to my fiance. Well, indeed, you'll learn some more. We're really going through these slowly, but in depth as they apply in informal logic. So the informal logic is part of the trivium there. That's really a combination of logic and rhetoric because it's applying some of the formal logic principles, but within a language context. So in fact, you do have the grammar aspect of it too. So this is really kind of a, culmination of the trivium, the foundational education. This stuff we were supposed to have learned in elementary school, right? So we're on to the loaded presuppositions. Some questions trap the respondent into damaging admissions. The presupposition itself does the work of accusation. So here's a classic one. Have you stopped abusing your spouse? Have you always been a liar, or are you just starting now? Loaded presuppositions. The application is both force prejudicial concessions, regardless of an answer. You see, they force that commitment, that assumption, regardless of how you answer, because any direct answer is part of that commitment. Accepting these propositions. So there's also hidden allegations in presuppositions. Some questions embedded allegations that are conceded when answered. Embedded allegations. Let's look at this. We have white. Did you make profitable investments from the money you obtained through your unethical use of government funds? And Mr. Black replies, no. So Mr. White replies to that, so you admit you made unethical use of government funds. I demand your resignation at once. Don't you know that unethical use of government funds is adequate reason for your dismissal? So you see how this gets twisted by that presupposition here. Did you make profitable investments from the money you obtained through your unethical use of government funds? The money you obtained through your unethical use of government funds is a proposition. When he replies no, he's accepted this. So now that's been assumed of that this is now committed to. This is an assumption. And if we get to the formal logic, you see that actually this is all still part of the informal here. Through formal logic, because if you have this part here is accepted, then the conclusion that follows is also going to be accepted by this logic here. So you admit that you made unethical use of government funds. See? From that presupposition. Quite tricky, but nevertheless, this is how some questions can embed the allegations. So we're going to get on to slide 5 here. The hidden allegations and presuppositions, part 2. The application here is saying no concedes the hidden presupposition. See, you concede to a hidden presupposition just by giving any direct answer. The follow-up exploits that concession, that unwitting concession, and loaded presuppositions discredit the respondent by design. You see this? Discredit the respondent by design because these loaded presuppositions. The trap lies not in the answer, but in the question itself. So the hidden allegations in the presuppositions. But then we also have harmless presuppositions. Not all presuppositions are fallacious. Many are harmless details. So let's look at this one. Is the man in the last row wearing the red hat a member of the psychology class? See, we're presupposing facts. Man, it's a red hat, but does no harm. You see how this works here. There's no pejoratives attached to those particular presuppositions. So sometimes that's just there for harmless details. Let's proceed. Then there's complex questions. These are the tricky ones. This is where you really have to pay attention because whoever's making the question is paying attention. Complex questions combine multiple elements. Some are harmless. Others can be traps. So, did you pick up your shirt and put it in the laundry? Will you open the door if Kevin forgets his key? Look how many different elements are being combined in here. If I lift the top part of the machine, push the yellow catch release, empty the paper in the roller, and then click the release catch back into place, would that clear this kind of jam? Provided I turn the power off and make sure not to stick my fingers in where the roller engages with the teeth. See how complex these can get. So the application here is complexity can be natural, conditional, or technical, not necessarily fallacious. However, overly complex parliamentary questions can be. Let's look at one here. Some questions overwhelm with length and presuppositions. All right, kick back here. We're going to listen to the Honorable Jean-Chrétien Saint-Maurice. Mr. Speaker. By the way, our author of this book is, I believe, Canadian, University of Windsor. I digress. Let's continue. Mr. Speaker, my question is directed to the Right Honorable Prime Minister. According to a story published in the press today, the Minister of Regional Industrial Expansion owns a company. He has a 50% interest in a company that manufactures shoes. And since he is responsible for the anti-dumping tribunal and for setting quotas on footwear, and the president of the company that said that the company was having problems because of imports, did the Right Honorable Prime Minister take necessary precautions when appointing the Minister of Industry, Trade, and Commerce or the Minister of Regional Industrial Expansion by asking him certain pertinent questions? And did the minister inform the Prime Minister of the potential conflict of interest that existed at the time? And if the Prime Minister was aware of the situation, how could the member in question become the minister of a department where he must make daily decisions that may affect the financial position of a company in which he has a 50% interest? Let's get off this slide quickly. So here comes part 2 of this. The Right Honorable Brian Mulroney, the Prime Minister, replies, I am surprised and surprised, that's what he said, I am surprised and surprised at the Honorable Member for asking such a question. However, I can assure him that all legal requirements were met before anyone was appointed, including the Minister in question. The Honorable Member is no doubt aware that from time to time, Canadian citizens, including members of this House who have worked in the business world, have been faced with certain problems, and I must say I have received every assurance that all legal requirements had been met, and that I am confident that the Honorable Member in question has the integrity and competence required to perform his duties as Minister. So the application here is, Christian's question embedded multiple allegations. Mulroney sidestepped by appealing to legality and integrity, not by answering each presupposition. So, what we learn from this, in a very verbose way, is that the complexity defeats a clear answer, because then it can just be answered back by appealing to things like the legality or the integrity, not each of the presuppositions that were made by Christian Saint-Maurice. As you see here, who could follow that? I definitely couldn't. All right. So what do we do when we get these complex questions? We divide them. When questions combine issues unfairly, they must be separated. So let's start with a complex question, and let's watch how we do this. Do you support fair hiring practices and job quotas for racial minorities? We separate this by saying, do you support fair hiring practices? And do you support job quotas for racial minorities? Two separate questions. The application. The division allows nuanced answers. Without division, it forces a distorted choice. So, when the questions are combined in such a manner, they need to be divided before they can be answered. Otherwise, it forces a distorted choice. Let's examine this more closely. Classic trap question. Here's how it works. The most famous loaded complex question in all of informal logic history. Have you stopped abusing your spouse? Come on. Stall on that one. Now, here's how we respond to that by dividing it. No, I have never abused my spouse in the past. And no, I am not abusing my spouse now. By dividing it into two answers, it defeats the trap. So, see how easily that can work. We have the harmless versus loaded yes and no. So here's a harmless one. Is Snow White? Versus, have you stopped abusing your spouse? So the application here is superficially identical forms, radically different effects. So again, without having, by language, there seems to be a lot in here that's abstracted. You don't see so clearly. Whereas in formal logic, you would see it. And that's why the difference is here. When we take statements that are combined and separating them in informal logic, they first need to be dissected and in such a manner that the lines of discernment are those of formal logic. That's why both the logic and rhetoric are necessary to really get to the level of informal logic here. So as we progress to the next slide here, disjunctive questions, traps and extremes. So disjunctive instead of conjunctive, we have the either or questions to limit alternatives. They may exclude correct or moderate answers. So, is a zebra black or white? Are you a pacifist or a warmonger? See these traps here of extremes? The abolitionists, reformers, or fanatics? See, these reduce complex realities to unfair dichotomies. Interesting point. And these are the things you point out when you find these types of traps, so to speak. Then we have the disjunctive persuasion. Disjunctions manipulate perception by limiting options. So here's an advertisement. Is the Papermate Dynagrip a great pen because it is so comfortable or because it writes smoothly, really smoothly? So great one here. Is the Papermate Dynagrip a great pen because it's so comfortable or because it writes really smoothly? So you could say that about anything. Like, is the Tribe channel a great channel because it's so informative or because the slideshows look really cool? Then we have the political disjunctive persuasion. Should we allow the government to take total control of healthcare, or must we allow physicians to be completely free of government regulation? The application is both limit options in ways that push a preferred conclusion. So it's another trap of persuasion, of disjunctive persuasion, taking you away from all the other choices you may have had, limiting them. And then we get on to the arguments from ignorance, and not this typical vernacular of ignorance, but just of a point of unknowing something. So an argument from ignorance is claiming truth from lack of proof. So look at this. Eliot says, how do you know that ghosts don't exist? Zelda says, well, nobody has ever proved that ghosts do exist, have they? Some philosophers have tried to disprove the existence of God, but they have always failed. Therefore, we can conclude with certainty that God exists. So, the application here is absence of proof does not prove absence, nor presence. That's a nice little statement there. Absence of proof does not prove absence, nor presence. Great little key takeaway there. Let's move to the next of arguments from ignorance, part 2. Sometimes absence of evidence supports presumption. Now we're on to presumptions, not presuppositions, but a presumption. Mr. X has never been found guilty of breaches of security or of any connections with the KGB, even though the Security Service has checked his record. Therefore, Mr. X is not a KGB spy. So obviously this example was from the first edition of this publication here, which was 1989. So that was towards the end of the Cold War. There was still this KGB, the Soviet security services there. So Mr. X has never been found guilty of breaches of security or of any connections with the KGB, even though the security service has checked his record. Therefore, Mr. X is not a KGB spy. And here's another example. I do not know that this rifle is unloaded. Therefore, it is reasonable to presume that it is loaded. So we have two applications here, a security context and a safety context. In a security and safety context, ignorance can justify reasonable presumptions. So, I have no knowledge of breaches of security. I have no knowledge of any connections with the KGB, right? And we've checked his records. We did due diligence. So now I can have a reasonable presumption that he's not a spy, right? And just like for the safety context, is that I do not know if it's unloaded. Therefore, it's reasonable to presume that it is. And that is a true safety context presumption. That's an argument from ignorance. So they can be valid in many cases. And we're on to appeals to ignorance with bias. No person who is reasonably intelligent and well informed could doubt that there has ever been any serious and well-established evidence for extrasensory perception. Therefore, extrasensory perception does not exist. So, there's an appeal to ignorance with bias, using lack of proof as proof of absence, which we learned before is not proper here in dealing with presumptions of this sort. So the ad hominem is also at play here, attacking the person rather than addressing the evidence. No person who is reasonably intelligent and well informed. The application here combines ignorance with the ad hominem. It dismisses opponents as unintelligent rather than addressing evidence. So again, using lack of proof as proof of absence is not bringing evidence, and attacking the person rather than addressing evidence, again, no consideration of evidence. Now we're on to a famous one, replying with a question. Sometimes it is best to question the question. This can shift the burden of proof. So, parent, why weren't you looking after my child properly? The hospital director, how can we look after 36 when you can't take care of one? The application here is clever but evasive. It's justifiable to resist unfair traps, but abusive only if used to avoid responsibility. So, fine line on that one, but you can see where that distinction occurs. All right, now we're on to one of everyone's favorite, begging the question and circularity. Begging the question is assuming something that must be proved. And of course, circular reasoning is something that undermines persuasion because it refers back to itself. So here's an example. God has all the virtues. Benevolence is a virtue. Therefore, God is benevolent. So what we see here are the presumptions here, right? Those haven't been proven. This one here is trying to assume something that must be proven, or apply to these, but they're not being proven that it applies. So again, then we have example 2 here is, this is a good one here for our circular reasoning. This is probably the best one I've seen. An efficiency expert. Efficiency expert, great. An efficiency, this guy definitely has never visited a government public body. An efficiency expert visiting a factory was told that the workers knew when to return to work because a gun was fired at exactly 1 o'clock by a man standing on the roof. When asked how he knew it was 1 o'clock, the man on the roof said that he verified the time by looking across the street to the clock on the store. The efficiency expert went to the store and asked the owner how often he checked his clock. He replied, "Never. It's always dead right by the 1 o'clock gun." So, the guy shooting the gun's looking at the clock, the guy setting the clock by when the gun goes off. It's circular reasoning. Both assume the very claim at issue, rendering the argument empty. All right. Yes, Bill Thomas, I think you were, that was a request you put in. I'm glad we were able to play that request tonight. It is begging the question to make a statement like, if it saves one child, is worth it. Yeah, like, well, exactly. It's something where you're basing it on something that needs to be proven that isn't. Polling questions and advocacy. No, we all know about these polls, right? The polls. Polls use wording to shape responses. Let's start with that part. Advocacy polling promotes a viewpoint disguised as inquiry. So the measuring part, if you're actually doing a poll for a true measure, it'd be, what is your opinion on tax policy? Which is an open-ended question for a survey of such. But then there's the steering, the viewpoint disguised. Do you support unfair tax increases that hurt hardworking families? So by embedding presuppositions or bias, pollsters appear to measure opinion while actually steering it. So if true statisticians out there and people that are trained in that type of measurement, they are this is part of their good practices, is to know the difference between the two, and certainly their clients would expect that. However, if you're there to promote a particular viewpoint and want to disguise his inquiry, you do these steering types of polling questions, which are really advocacy. All right, then there's the push polling. Push polling is manipulative polling disguised as research. It uses leading questions to persuade instead of measure. So disguised persuasion under the appearance of legitimate research. Legitimate would be, what is your opinion on candidate X? But the push polling would say, would you be more or less likely to support candidate X if you knew they had been accused of corruption? Oh boy. The polling becomes propaganda, not neutral inquiry. Push polling. We've seen this way too much now, so it's gone beyond advocacy, it seems. All right, well, that brings us to the rules for good dialogue. Good questioning should allow honest answers, not be leading. The burden of proof must be respected, not to shift it unnecessarily, answering questions with questions. Coercive or manipulative questioning undermines dialogue, in which case questioning the question would be valid. So, by recognizing loaded, complex, and unfair questions, we protect fairness and truth. Logic is not only technical, it is ethical. Bill Thomas says, this is a fallacy when you combine trivial and serious matters in a poll. For example, 1 in 4 students said they had been victims. Yeah, well, again, the push polling, the advocacy polling, indeed. So one of the things, let's see, we could do here. See if I can get something here up for us. Yeah, we have a little distinctions here we could look at really quick, since this one went by pretty quick. The formal logic, these are our core terms. Formal logic you could think of being more like working out formulas. It's structurally rigid. We have terms like validity, where the conclusion must be true if the premises are true. There's a structural necessity. It's not so much about the content as the structure here. There's a soundness the symbolic notation, which we'll look at real quick, which really separates it from the informal logic, the rules of inference, which are very mechanical, like the modus ponens, which we kind of went over before, that if one part is accepted as part of the presupposition, that the rest will follow. So it's for deriving the valid conclusions. You have counterexamples, the case showing true premises and false conclusions proving invalidity. Deductive arguments, which are to follow necessarily from the premises. So this isn't a degree of certainty. This is, intended to follow necessarily. There's syllogisms, which are the deductive argument with two premises and one conclusion, like all A or B. And of course, there's consistency. The statements can be all true without contradiction. And then it uses the nomenclature for constructing these things like this. For all every as a universal qualifier, existential qualifier, there exists some. So some birds can fly. If then with the implication, P implies Q. All of these are here. Therefore, and we have logical equivalence is equivalent to. This is all part of formal logic. So this is part where in the background, this is what provides these rules that we use in informal logic. Then we get to informal logic, and we have terms like strength, premises that make a conclusion probable. We're not down to the necessity here. It's real world persuasiveness. There's weakness and strength. See these kind of terms here? The premises fail to support conclusion. As we read before, irrelevant, insufficient, unacceptable. We have fallacies, which reasoning error undermining the argument. So relevance and irrelevance, as we spoke of, logically connected to the conclusion. Whereas in a formal logic, you can see this easily. Once it brings it to informal logic, because it's done through the matters of language and grammar, it takes a little bit of a finer discernment to see these errors. So we have things like sufficiency, the premises that provide enough evidence for the conclusion. Clear and convincing evidence, all these different degrees. There's acceptability, where the premises are plausible, credible, backed by evidence. Of course, we have implied premise, the implicit premise, unstated assumption linking premises to conclusion, and the inductive argument opposed to the deductive, where premises make conclusion likely but not certain. So there are some distinctions here, but you can see where the rhetoric and the grammar comes into play, into the grammar of language comes into play for the informal logic. And in formal logic, it's done with symbology, and it's done through a very rigid structure. But it can be quite complex. That's why you need these type of terms, and it can be more easily dissected than you can with the informal logic. And that's why we have both, and that's why they're both taught along with rhetoric, so you learn about the values of the persuasion from that. Okay, enough of that. I'd like to thank everyone for coming in tonight and going over some of this questions and answers in dialogue. And if there's people are enjoying this, I guess just hit that thumbs up, and we'll continue on with the series from this good book from Mr. Douglas Walton, illustrious author and head of quite a few organizations that involve with informal logic and argumentation. So, of course, if you're going to learn, you want to learn from the best of the best. That said, I want to salute you all for being here tonight, and I hope to see you all on the next one. Peace out.